Mr. Hardy, if you look about a quarter of a way down from the top, this is an email from you to John Nyland, Ken Parkhill, and others, correct?
Yes,
Written on October 4th, 2017.
that's correct.
Now, it says, John, below are some recommended questions for ISO NE as part of the correct decision. Is that correct?
Yes,
What correct decision are you talking about? Is it the disqualification of Unit 2?
I believe that's what this is referring to, yes.
Now, what you did is you recommended the following question as the first one. Based on our experience before the Rhode Island EFSB and NTE Killingly's experience before the Connecticut Siting Council, it appears that the applicable state permitting boards are unlikely to approve the construction of new natural gas plants without having secured a CSO through an FCA, correct?
That's correct.
Is that still your opinion today?
So, as background,
Well, it's a yes or a no question. Is that your opinion?
these questions were prepared for John in a discussion with the ISO New England.
Okay.
So
Is what this-
it's not my opinion. It is questions that were prepared for John for discussion with ISO New England.
You prepared this question.
That's
and you
correct.
suggested to John that this question be asked of ISO New England.
That's correct.
All right. Could you, do you still have the application section 7? I think we've already established that section 7 of the application is the part of the application you're responsible for. Is that correct?
That's correct. I contributed to section 7. What page are you on?
I'm on page 115. Section 7.0, assessment of need.
Okay, I'm there.
All right, now I want to make a general disclaimer for you and the other people in the room and the board. Jerry Elmer did a wonderful job and probably asked about half of the questions I was already planning to ask. So I'm going to be doing some editing on the fly as we go along to try not to be repetitive.
Okay.
That may take me a little bit of time as I go over my notes. You may find some pauses. For that, I apologize. Also, I'll ask you, if you feel that you have already had that question asked, and if you've already answered it, alert me to that. Okay? And I'll try to deal with that because I'm not trying to be repetitive.
Okay.
All right? Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Before we get started, Mr. Marco, I could ask, has this email been identified anywhere in the record?
It has not, and thank you, Chairperson. I should have moved its entrance. First, I should ask that it be marked as the next Barville exhibit, which I believe is 41.
Wait, I thought it was already in Energy Exhibit 151.
I apologize. It is. I apologize. It is part of Barville 151.
In
I'm sorry. Invenergy 151. It's part of the package, and it's in there.
Okay.
If it makes any sense to mark it separately as a Barville exhibit, I'm happy to do that. No. Okay.
No, I think that's fine. I just wanted to know if there was some way it would be found in the record.
No. Thank you, Ms. Rudy. I appreciate that.
And if my understanding is correct, other parts of that same exhibit are subject to the non-disclosure agreement, but Invenergy has permitted this single page to be used with people in the room. The only reason I mention that is I don't want other portions of that same previously admitted Invenergy exhibit to come out where it shouldn't.
And the number again?
Invenergy 151, and Mr. Elmer is correct, we don't have an objection to using this one. Or this portion of 151, I should say.
And thank you for getting that clarified on the record. I appreciate it. So, Mr. Hardy, you're on section 7.0, assessment of need, which I believe is also up on the screen. Now, 7.1, did you write this or substantially contribute to it?
Substantially contributed, yes. This is part of a description of the market that's been included here. It's been included in other reports that we've done for New England.
And what's in here you agree with?
Yes.
So section 7.1 is entitled Standards for Determining Need for the Proposed Facility, correct?
Yes.
Now, in the second paragraph, the last 3 lines, beginning with the word system planning, do you see that? System planning for capacity and reliability within ISO NE member states is accomplished through ISO NE's Forward Capacity Market, FCM, Capacity Procurement Mechanism, approved by FERC in 2006, correct?
Correct.
And that's still the case, correct?
Yes.
And system planning for capacity and reliability, as I think you established with Mr. Elmer, is basically a statement of saying how much is needed for reliability, correct?
Yes, it's a component of overall need, specifically reliability, yes.
The next paragraph says, as members of ISO NE, Rhode Island LSEs, and could you explain what LSEs are?
Yeah, that's an acronym for load serving entities.
Okay. Rely upon the ISO NE FCM Forward Capacity Market Capacity Procurement Mechanism developed by ISO NE stakeholders and approved by FERC, in which ISO NE seeks to procure sufficient capacity on both a system-wide and localized basis 3 years in advance of a delivery year, DY, in order to meet projected peak demand plus minimum target reserve margins, correct?
Yes,
And that's still correct today, correct?
it is.
This was written, as it says up in the upper right-hand corner, at the end of October 2015, correct?
That's correct.
All right, now 7.1.2 at the bottom of the page talks about ISO NE's Forward Capacity Market Capacity Procurement Mechanism, correct?
Yes.
And it says that in the first sentence that it's a means to ensure that the ISO NE power system has sufficient resources to reliably meet the future demand for electricity, correct?
Yes.
And the next sentence says, under the FCM, forward capacity auctions, FCA, are utilized as a market-based approach to determine both system-wide and localized needs for both existing and new generation capacity through a competitive auction process designed to select a portfolio of existing and new resources needed for system-wide and local reliability with the greatest social surplus, right?
That's correct.
And the last sentence says, in other words, resources that clear an FCA are, by definition, the resources that maximize social surplus in order to meet both system-wide and local reliability needs. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And is that still the case today?
Yes.
Now, on the next page, 116, at the top of the page, in the second sentence, we discussed this briefly with Mr. Elmer. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it, but the second sentence reads, in addition to the FCA, annual, seasonal, and monthly reconfiguration auctions are held in order to adjust the amount of capacity needed, correct?
Correct.
In the next paragraph, first sentence, it says the capacity that is required to meet ISO NE's future system-wide demand is called the installed capacity requirement, ICR, correct?
Yes.
The third sentence in that second paragraph says, additionally, the FCM, the forward capacity market, takes into account locational capacity needs to ensure that regional zones have sufficient capacity to maintain reliability when transmission constraints prevent the delivery of electricity to any particular capacity zone, correct?
Yes.
And that's still the case, correct?
Yes.
Right. Now down to 7.2 in the middle of the page. It's entitled Need for the Proposed Facility. And the proposed facility is correct?
Yes.
And it states that ISO's next FCA for the 2019-2020 capacity commitment period, FCA 10, which will be held in February 2016. This auction will ultimately determine the capacity that is needed in the market for reliability in ISO NE during the 2019/2020 DY. And DY stands for
Delivery year.
delivery year. And the CREC intends to participate in this auction, correct?
Correct.
As a planned participant in FCA 10, the system-wide and local need for Clear River's capacity will be determined via the FCM capacity auction mechanism, correct?
Correct.
In other words, if the facility clears FCA 10, then ISO NE will have determined, correct, to be a needed resource that maximizes social surplus to meet the overall system-wide and local reliability needs of ISO NE, correct?
That's correct.
And that is still the case today.
Yes.
And in FCA 10, correct, did bid the full 1,000 megawatts, correct?
I believe so.
Right. But they were awarded only Unit 1, just under 500 megawatts, correct?
That's correct.
And as we sit here today, the Unit 1 CSO has been terminated, correct?
That's correct.
Now, when you were doing your analysis of this, you knew that this write-up regarding the standards for determining need would be reviewed by this board, correct?
Yes.
And you never claimed in that write-up that CREC was needed due to future retirements. It doesn't say anything about future retirements on page 115 and 116 under the need analysis, does it?
In the application, no.
And again, in the application, you never stated that the issue of whether or not CREC was needed was a broader issue than clearing an FCA, did you?
No, in the application, we were specifically addressing need as it relates to reliability, and it was not expanded outside of that, I don't believe, in this application.
Okay. And I think we've established Unit 2 has never cleared an FCA, correct?
That's correct.
And would you agree with me that under the definition of reliability need, as you've outlined it on pages 115 and 116 of the application, both Unit 1, having had its CSO terminated, and Unit 2, having never received a CSO, failed to meet the need test as outlined on those 2 pages?
Well, Clear River Unit 1 didn't clear FCA 10, so in that particular case, they did clear that auction, and I think that demonstrated need. But you're correct, as we sit here today, neither Unit 1 nor Unit 2 have a CSO card.
And the need test that you outlined on page 115 and 116 of the application related directly to obtaining a CSO through the forward capacity market, correct?
As it relates to need in terms of reliability, that's correct.
Thank you. Now,
Can I just ask a question? You keep saying, as it pertains to need in the context of reliability, I don't know if you want to scroll up on that application, was that made clear that because it seems like your application was talking about the overall need test, and then you're making this kind of assertion that if it clears the FCA, then there is need, but now you're saying that's only a reliability. And I didn't see that clearly in the application, so I'm wondering where we can deduce that.
It's a great question. So in my testimony, both in direct and subsequent testimonies, I talk about multiple aspects of need as it relates specifically to Invenergy's application in Section 7. It dealt, as Mr. McElroy pointed out, it really only dealt with need as it relates to reliability. So in my subsequent testimony, I expanded and provided more detail on need that was not included in the application.
Now, you also discussed reconfiguration auctions on page 116, correct?
Yes.
And you've discussed that with Mr. Elmer as well, correct?
Correct.
And we've established that Invenergy replaced Unit 1's capacity supply obligation with a substitute capacity in the annual reconfigurations for FCAs 10 and 11, correct?
They closed out of those obligations, that's correct. They closed out of their capacity obligations.
Well, you're using a different term. Are you disagreeing with me that they replaced their obligation with substitute capacity?
I don't know if they replaced their obligation with substitute capacity.
Because of the confidentiality of it?
That information is, the only thing that we know is that they closed out of their obligation in that auction. So I don't know what the substitute was. I would say it's a decent assertion that that was some substitute capacity, but I don't know that to the case.
All right, that's fair. Assuming that it is a substitute capacity, then another source of local and system-wide capacity will be meeting the CSO that had been given to, correct?
If it is indeed capacity.
Right. And at least with respect to FCA's 10 and 11, the system will not have correct Unit 1's physical capacity, and any need will be satisfied in some alternative way, correct?
That's correct.
Now back to the application on page 118. 7.2.1.2 conclusions, do you see that?
Yes.
In the middle of the third line, PA projects that correct would clear FCA 10. Do you see that?
Yes.
And when you made that projection or that forecast, you were projecting the entire 1,000 megawatts clearing in FCA 10.
That's correct.
And you state again in the last sentence that as previously outlined by definition, if the facility clears FCA 10, then ISO NE, and by proxy, Rhode Island LSEs, whom are participants in ISO NE, will have determined correct to be a needed resource that maximizes social surplus to meet the overall system-wide and local reliability needs of ISO NE, correct?
Correct.
Am I oversimplifying it to say that the phrase reliability need is basically the need to have enough resources available to keep the lights on? All right, if we could look at page 120, please. Down at the bottom, page 7.3. It says need analysis conclusion. Do you see that?
Yes.
The analysis conducted in this section has demonstrated that the FCM, the forward capacity market, is the appropriate and core mechanism to determine system need for member states within ISO NE. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
That's still the case?
Yes.
While FCA 10 will ultimately determine if CREC is needed, PA's analysis suggests that the facility will clear the auction, correct?
Correct.
And we know only half of it did, correct?
That's right.
As previously outlined by definition, if the facility clears FCA 10, then ISO NE and by proxy Rhode Island LSEs, whom are participants in ISO NE, will determine CREC to be a needed resource that maximizes social surplus to meet the overall system-wide and local reliability needs of ISO NE, which is a repeat of what you said earlier, correct?
That's correct.
And that was your conclusion then, and it's your conclusion now, correct?
Yes.
Could we look at page 124, please? Now, I believe in data responses, you stated you were also responsible for at least substantial contributions to 10.0.
To parts of this, that's correct.
Would you have contributed to the second paragraph?
As part of the forward capacity market, that paragraph?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so let's read the first sentence. It says, as part of the forward capacity market, FCM, ISO New England Inc., ISO NE, conducts a forward capacity auction, FCA, 3 years in advance of each capacity commitment period, CCP, to meet the region's resource adequacy needs. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And that's still the case, correct?
That's correct.
Could you look at page 126, please? Do you see the first full paragraph at the top of the page that begins wind turbines?
Yes.
Do you see the reference in there to, well, let me just read it. Wind turbines also cause bird mortality, especially for raptors, resulting from collision with rotating blades. The rotating blades also affect bats and the Indiana bat, a federally listed endangered species, habits almost all of Pennsylvania. Recent opposition to wind farms has led to shutdowns and curtailments of operation for fear that Indiana bats might be killed. Was this paragraph taken from another document that dealt with Pennsylvania?
I'm not sure. I didn't write this paragraph.
So you had nothing to do with that?
No.
Could we look at your pre-filed testimony at the PUC, please? Let me know when you have it.
The director was
The initial pre-file.
Is that Exhibit 38? Right?
No,
Yes.
I don't have the exhibit number.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Almost there. Okay,
Take your time.
good.
No rush. Okay, so this is really the first testimony you filed dealing with Clear River, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And this was filed at the PUC as opposed to before this board, correct?
Yes.
And on page 3, line 15, you stated that there are two reasons for your testimony. One, with regard to the need for Clear River Energy Center, and the other, the cost justification for the facility, correct?
That's correct.
And the purpose of this was to assist the PUC in issuing its advisory opinion to this board, correct?
Correct.
All right, and then on page 4, line 10, you stated that your analysis indicates that the Clear River Energy Center is needed to cost-effectively maintain reliability in ISO/NE and to support the introduction of more renewable energy projects into the ISO/NE region. I base this conclusion on both the results of ISO/NE's most recent capacity auction, that's FCA 10, I assume, other information from ISO/NE, and my modeling of subsequent auctions. Am I wrong in my assumption? Was the most recent capacity auction that you're referencing there FCA 10?
I think at the time of this testimony, the most recent capacity auction that would have occurred was FCA 9.
Okay. Does this testimony have a date anywhere on it? Well, it was either 9 or 10, correct? FCA 9 or
Yeah.
FCA 10.
That's correct.
Now, on page 5, beginning on line 2, you're talking about the advisory opinion issued by the PUC in the Indec case. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you quote from that opinion, beginning on line 2, and it says, as a result of the new era of competition, the need for generating plants is determined by the free market, correct?
Correct.
And that market that you're referring to is the market that's run by ISO/NE, correct?
Correct.
Now at the bottom of page 6, line 21, you have a heading 1.2, assessment of the need for Clear River Energy Center, correct?
Correct.
And then on page 7, line 17, you state what I just asked you, which is, ISO NE's FCM capacity procurement mechanism is utilized by ISO NE market participants as a means to ensure that the ISO NE power system has sufficient resources to reliably meet the future demand for electricity, correct?
Mine starts on line 18, might be off by one, but that's correct.
Okay. Now, I think if you look at page 8, line 17, I think we can clarify my earlier question to you about whether it was FCA 9 or 10, because the question to you is, what were the actual results of FCA 10? Do you see that?
I do.
So the earlier answer must have been
It
FCA
was
10.
FCA 10, that's correct.
And you summarize on the first sentence beginning on line 18, on February 8, 2016, FCA 10 concluded with 1,459 megawatts of new generation clearing the auction with a system-wide capacity price of $703 per kilowatt month, correct?
Yes.
And you talk about the new cleared capacity generation consisting primarily of 3 facilities. The first bullet on line 21, 485 megawatts for Invenergy's Clear River Energy Center. Going over to the top of page 9, on line 1, the PSEG 484 megawatt Bridgeport Harbor, and line 3, the NRG 330 megawatt Canal 3, correct?
Yes.
Now we know that the Invenergy Clear River Energy Center CSO has been pulled and it hasn't been licensed or started construction, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us what you're aware of with regard to the status of the 484 megawatt Bridgeport Harbor 6?
I believe it is on schedule to come online to meet its CSO this year.
Okay, and so it must be substantially complete?
I believe so.
Okay. And what about the NRG 333 megawatt Canal 3 facility?
I'm not sure where Canal 3 is in its process. I haven't heard of any substantial delays, but I can't confirm where it is in its process.
But it is under construction.
I believe so, yes.
Is Bridgeport Harbor a fast start, fast ramp facility?
Is it a fast start?
Yes.
I believe it has fast start ramping capabilities, yes.
All right. What about-
I believe it to be of a similar configuration to Clear River.
What about Canal 3?
Canal 3 is a peaking facility. It would have the ability to start fast as well.
So then at the bottom of page 9, you forecasted results for FCA 11. And I do know that Mr. Elmer has gone through this with you, but you did forecast that an additional 485 megawatts of combined cycle capacity, that is, I assume, a reference to Unit 2,
Correct.
and you forecasted that it would clear FCA 11.
That's correct.
And it did not.
That's correct.
Okay, now I want to start looking at your rebuttal testimony at the PUC. And I apologize, I don't have the exhibit number, but I'm going to be going through, kind of compulsive like this, I'm going to be going through your documentation that was filed essentially in chronological order, from one testimony to the next. So we're now looking at your rebuttal at the PUC.
Which is in Energy Exhibit 39.
Thank you, Ms. Verdi.
Okay.
You have it?
Yes.
redacted version in front of me, but I'm not going to be asking anything that's confidential.
He just said he has a redacted version, but he's not going to be asking.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I have the I think I might have said that wrong. I have the
No,
confidential.
you said it correctly.
I did.
But I don't think you said what you meant.
I apologize, let me clear it up. In front of me, with my notes, I have the confidential version. I will not, however, be drawing his attention to any confidential information. Did I get that right? All right. On page 2, please. Line 10, there's a heading for assessment of need, correct?
Yes.
And then you ask yourself a question, why is the forward capacity market, parens FCM, the appropriate mechanism to determine the need for clear rudder? Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And then on lines 17 to 18, in answering that question, you said, the FCM is the competitive free market mechanism that determines need for new power generating plants and ISO NE, correct?
Correct.
And that's still the case today, correct?
Yes.
Page 3, you ask yourself the question, is the FCM the free market mechanism that determines the need for new generating units in ISO NE? You answer yes. As defined by ISO NE, the FCM, forward capacity market, is the, quote, long-term wholesale market that assures resource adequacy locally and system-wide. The market is designed to promote economic investment in supply and demand resources where they are needed most, and the words where they are needed most are bolded and the quote is ended. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there's a footnote there, and that footnote 2 goes, it's at the bottom of the page, and it's a reference to ISO NE's introduction to New England's forward capacity market, correct?
Yes.
While you're thinking, Mr. McElroy, just looking at what's on the screen here. So would I be right to conclude under that logic that the second unit was never needed or never determined to be needed?
It was not determined to be needed under the FCA market construct because it never cleared an FCA. I've talked about in my testimony the PUC advisory opinions and other elements of need, but as it relates to the full capacity auction, that would be correct.
On page 5, lines 16 through 18, we talk about the press release that ISO issued after FCA 10. And it states, beginning on line 16, ISO NE affirmed that FCA 10, quote, provided the incentives for developers to bring new dash and needed dash, and the words and needed are bolded, resources to the market, end quote, correct?
Yes.
And then on page 6, line 15 to 16, you state all cleared capacity in an FCA is needed by ISO NE in order to maximize the value for the ratepayer in meeting its reliability target. Is that correct?
Yes.
Next, I'd like to look at the transcript of the PUC hearing July 25th, 2016. And I'd like to go to page 144.
Mike, is it your recollection that that's been made an exhibit?
I don't know if it's been marked as an exhibit. I do know that administrative notice has been taken of the entire record at the PUC, without, of course, the opinion itself.
I don't have the entire PUC record ready to be pulled up.
Okay.
I only have exhibits ready. If you give me advance notice previously, I can do it, but
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think, I don't have that many questions. I think we can do it the old-fashioned. Do you happen to have it with you?
I don't.
This, you recall that hearing, you were at that hearing, correct?
Yes,
And you testified, correct?
I did.
And you know a transcript was made of your testimony.
Yes.
And so I'm going to ask you if you recall some of these questions and if you still feel the same way, okay?
Okay.
On page 144, and I'm going to do a little, I'm going to try to make this a little shorter than just quoting it word for word. If you object, let me know. On page 144, you confirm that your analysis of FCA 10 was based on Invenergy clearing both turbines. You said it was.
Yes.
And on page 145, question, did Invenergy clear both turbines in the auction? Answer, they did not. Question, were you wrong about that? Answer, yes. Do you recall those questions and answers?
Sounds familiar, yes.
Okay, and beginning on 152 and going over to 153. And if you'd like, I have no problem with you seeing this if you feel it's helpful to you to actually look at it in black and white. But on page 152, lines 1 through 5, the question says, now, on your direct testimony, your first file testimony, page 10, lines 3 through 5, you stated the capacity that clears in FCA is by definition needed, correct? Answer, that's correct. You agree with that?
Yes.
Then page 152, line 21. Now, if FCA is equal to need as you stated on page 10, line 3, would you agree with me that even under your own reasoning, there is no need demonstrated by ISO for the remaining megawatts of the proposed approximate 1,000 megawatt plant? You're referring to Clear River? Me, I am. Your answer, under FCA 10, that's correct. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you agree with that?
Yes.
On page 154, starting on line 4, this was the question. Assuming that Invenergy does not get the award and it goes to another project, then the benefits that would be generated by that proposed project would still accrue to the Rhode Island ratepayer, wouldn't it? You answered, the answer depends on where that project is located. Do you recall that?
I do.
And that's the right answer, correct?
Yes.
Right. And then I clarified by saying, I mean the newly configured zone that we're currently in. And you said the SENE zone, and I said yes. Do you recall that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So then you said, if another project cleared instead of Clear River in the FCA zone, but not in Rhode Island, the benefits relating to capacity prices would certainly accrue to Rhode Island ratepayers, but not the benefits related to energy. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And that's correct, right?
Yes.
You were also asked whether the Clear River Energy Project is permitted or not. Rhode Island will still need to import power from other portions of ISO New England, correct? And you said at times, yes, that's correct. Still
I agree with that. Yes.
Yes. On page 170, I asked you to explain the net installed capacity requirement. And there was a little clarification, but your response essentially was, so prior to each capacity auction, the ISO determines the minimum amount of capacity that's needed to keep the market, essentially to keep the lights on. And you would agree with that, you agreed with me earlier, correct?
Yes.
I'm sorry I stole your phrase.
I'm glad I agreed with you before.
Good. Well, I was using your own words. Now I'm moving to Invenergy's post-hearing memorandum in docket 4609. I don't know if you have that. You don't have that. Okay. I'm going to read you some statements from Invenergy's post-hearing memorandum that was filed in docket 4609 and ask you if you believe those statements are accurate. Okay. On page 1 of 10, it says, the ISO has determined that CREC is needed to meet the reliability needs of the region by awarding a capacity supply obligation per CSO in its recent competitive wholesale capacity auction. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
As of that time, correct?
Yes.
Same page in paragraph 2, the project is cost justified because a competitive wholesale market process awarding CREC a CSO has ensured, and future auctions will ensure, that the capacity prices and the energy prices for CREC's electric generation are cost justified. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and on page 3 of 10, the heading in the 5th line says the need for CREC is determined in the competitive market. We've already established that, correct?
Yes.
And then in the second full paragraph, it says, Invenergy was recently awarded a CSO for 485 megawatts in FCA 10, with a reference to an exhibit. The award of a CSO by itself is compelling evidence of need. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
On page 5, there's a reference to the testimony of Seth Parker. Now, you've read the testimony of Mr. Parker, correct?
I have.
And Mr. Parker filed testimony in the PUC matter, correct?
Correct.
And the memorandum states, Seth Parker, parens Mr. Parker, testified that, quote, if CREC clears in future FCAs and is awarded CSOs, it will be needed. If CREC fails to get a CSO in the future, it will not be needed. Do you recall reading that?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with the first part of it. I agree that clearing an FCA and or having a CSO is a clear determinant of need. I don't agree that the inverse is true, that not having a CSO means the plant is not needed.
Well, but you would agree with me, subject to check if you see this, that Invenergy in its post-hearing memorandum told the PUC exactly that.
Okay.
Do you agree with
I
that?
agree that it is there, yes.
Right. And so you disagree with the second part of what's been quoted from Mr. Parker's testimony?
I do.
But you don't disagree that he said it?
No.
Are you familiar with Mr. Parker?
I'm familiar with his testimony, and I saw him testify during the PUC hearings.
All right.
I don't know him personally.
But what about the company he works for? Are you familiar with that company?
Which company was it?
I don't remember the name. Do you?
Is it
Cambridge?
Leviton?
Leviton, right.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Leviton Associates, yes.
And they are well regarded in the industry.
Yes.
On page 7, the memorandum says, the competitive power market determines whether CREC is cost justified by clearing the auction and being awarded a CSO. By definition, CREC is cost justified. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Now I'm going to move on to your pre-filed direct testimony in this document. The first one you filed on June 30th, 2017.
Okay.
Chairperson, at this point I have a motion, and I'll be making a similar motion for subsequent testimony filed by Mr. Hardy. What he did in this testimony and in subsequent testimony is he summarized the conclusions of the PUC advisory opinion at some length in his testimony, in different places in his testimony. Because this board has rejected that advisory opinion, I believe it's inappropriate now for his testimony to stand as it currently does, summarizing those conclusions. Those conclusions have been rejected. So I would move with regard to this testimony, and I'll file a separate motion with regard to the later one, to strike all reference to the conclusions of the PUC advisory opinion, which begin on page 32, line 6, and continue through page 34, line 4.
Is there any response?
As usual, I believe first this motion comes too late, but secondly, frankly, since this board will be making the determination on need and has rejected the PUC opinion, I think it will be fully capable on its own of determining what portion of Mr. Hardy's testimony or any other witnesses is appropriate and what part isn't without serial motions. I think motions are both untimely and appropriate.
Well, my feeling is that it was a relatively recent decision by this board, and the correct decision to rule that the conclusions were stale. And I think those portions of the testimony that just repeat the conclusions set forth in the PUC advisory opinion, if they're not stricken, essentially will come in as evidence. And I think it would contradict the board's ruling to allow those conclusions to be admitted as full in light of the fact that the PUC's conclusions themselves have been rejected.
The only final thing I'll say is on the issue of timing. It's not recent. The ruling was October 31, over 2 months ago. This board rule requires any motions to be filed within 10 days of the date on which the subject matter arises. That hasn't happened here. It's far too late. But again, I think this board is fully capable, once this hearing is over, once post-hearing briefs have been submitted, to determine what it should look at and what it shouldn't look at.
And I don't just...
Mr. McElroy, isn't it already in evidence?
It is already, all of these are already in evidence. I've never been objected to before.
Yes, Chairperson, everything has already been made full. But of course, this evidence was filed on June 30th, 2017. Subsequently, this board rejected the PUC advisory opinion conclusions, and Mr. Hardy is discussing those conclusions again when they've been rejected. So do I feel that this board is fully capable of reviewing this evidence and making a determination? Of course I do. I just think that it's, from a technical standpoint, it's better to have everything that's going to be rejected and stricken.
But again, the only motion that was before this board on October 31 was rejecting the PUC opinion, not anybody else's testimony.
And the only thing I'm asking is that...
Mr. Elmer wants to make some.
Oh, I'm sorry, but the only thing I'm asking is that the portions of his testimony that simply repeat the PUC conclusions that have been rejected, in my opinion, need to be stricken. I'm sorry.
If I may, I would say two things very briefly about Mr. McElroy's motion. One is Invenergy's objection to the motion being untimely may be exalted formal substance. The fact is that the EFSB has rejected the PUC opinion. References to it sort of fall into line. Second, however, I understand Mr. Blazer's objection on timeliness in a broader context, and he does have a point. As Mr. Nyland testified, this plant has been under consideration since 2014. The docket has been open since 2015. It's now 2019. We're hearing from Mr. Hardy's speculation that maybe the turbine might be qualified in a future auction. And if there were to be any substantial changes, modifications to the application, requests for delays from Invenergy, changes that would delay things, I would like the opportunity to quote back Mr. Blazer's concern about timeliness, particularly in the context that we're now in the fourth year of this docket, and we're still waiting to hear justification as to need.
One final comment, if I may, because every time Jerry talks, I feel compelled to say something. My objection was not with respect to the timeliness of this proceeding. It was very specifically with respect to the timeliness of Mr. McElroy's motion. As for extolling form over substance, these rules are these rules for a reason. They're not there just to be ignored willy-nilly at the request of the attorney. Those have been made very clear, as a matter of fact, previously, when, for example, we tried to address documents that had been submitted on a timely basis. And we weren't allowed to do that because we submitted them in a timely fashion. It's one of the reasons, for example, you'll see tomorrow, I first obtained agreement from counsel with respect to some documents that were going to be submitted to the record, presumably in time tomorrow. So these rules have been enforced before. They were there for a reason. This motion's untimely. The only motion that was made with respect to the PUC opinion was specifically with respect to the PUC opinion. That was granted. Nothing was said about any pre-existing testimony, which the chairperson, as you know, is already in the record. With that said, again, the three of you are fully capable of going through all of this testimony, a daunting task to say the least, and determining what you think is appropriate to consider and what isn't. Thank you.
I'm going to deny it because it's all of that is we've already read it all. We've already discussed it, I believe, in some of the parties' house, and I think that the board has already indicated what value this is on the information.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, could you look at page 6, please? Line 11 is a heading entitled Need for Clear River Energy Center, correct?
Yes.
And on line 20 to 22, you ask yourself a question, can you please provide the board an overview of the ISO-NE market that you use for your assessment of the need for the CREC, correct?
Yes.
And then at the bottom of page 7, lines 21 through 23, you ask yourself the question, is the FCM, forward capacity market, the free market mechanism that determines the need for new generating units in ISO-NE's wholesale markets? And you answer the question on page 8 at the top of line 1, yes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Still the case today? Correct?
Yes.
On page 8, lines 11 through 13, you ask yourself the question, are there any ISO NE market rules that explain how ISO NE views the FCA or capacity auction process as a mechanism to determine the need for a project, correct?
Yes.
And then you discuss some of the rules, correct?
Yes.
And on page 8, lines 22 to 23, you state, by clearing this type of free market auction, the ISO NE has determined a project to be needed. Correct? Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Still the case, correct?
Yes.
Page 11, please. Now, this is more recent testimony, so you're summarizing at this point in time the results of FCA 11, correct? Page 11, line 2.
Correct.
On line 3, you state that on February 6, 2017, ISO NE's FCA 11 concluded with a system-wide clearing price of $5.30 per kilowatt month, correct?
Yes.
And that was a reduction in price from FCA 10, which was in excess of $7, correct?
Correct.
What, in your experience and opinion, what does a declining capacity price say about whether the need is increasing or decreasing?
I'm not sure that it necessarily indicates need is increasing or decreasing. I mean, when I look at forward capacity market clearing prices, what I would say is there's definitely a relationship overall in generally in the tightness of the market, that is the supply that clears relative to demand. So stated another way, if the market is short of capacity, like it was in FCA's 8 and 9, you have significantly higher capacity prices than you did in FCA 10 and 11, where you had at least the amount of capacity to meet net ICR.
Well, a very high capacity price, like there was in FCA 9, is certainly a signal to developers that more capacity is needed, correct?
Correct.
A low capacity price would be a signal to developers that new capacity is not necessarily needed, correct?
Maybe that less capacity is needed. I think you could say that, yes. I wouldn't say that no capacity is needed. I think it all depends on what capacity we're talking about. And I talk about that at length in my testimony. I think and this has been in some of the PUC advisory opinions in the past, even if you have sufficient capacity to meet demand, if you bring new, efficient megawatts into the system that can displace older, less efficient, higher polluting resources, there's a need for that. And that's good for the system, and that's good for ratepayers. So I wouldn't say that just because you have an auction where supply exceeds net ICR that there's no need for new capacity.
Well, let me ask you this. In the last forward capacity auction, were any new generating facilities awarded a CSO?
Are you talking about FCA 12?
Yes.
There was new capacity that cleared the auction, but to my knowledge, there was not a new generating facility similar to Clear River that cleared the market.
And the price in the last auction, would you characterize it as low?
It was lower than the previous auction.
Well, would you characterize it as low?
As compared to what?
To the usual market price in the last 5 years.
as compared to the market price in previous auctions, it was lower. I don't know how I would define usual market price. There is no usual market price.
All right. Would you at least agree with me that when the price is high, it's sending a signal to developers that new generating capacity is needed?
Yes, and I think we talked about this before because I characterized the price as high and then clarified that when I said it was high, higher than what a new generating facility would need. So yes, I would characterize that as a signal that new generation is needed.
But you're not willing to characterize a low price as a signal that new generation is not needed?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I guess it's too vague of a reference for me to say with absolute certainty.
Well, I wasn't asking absolute certainty, I was asking your opinion.
Okay.
I mean, if you were advising a client, and they came to you and they said, you know, the most recent FCA closed at $4 and change. Do you think it's a good time for me to bid in a 1,000 megawatt generating facility in the zone?
I would say that depends on that client's, the economics for their facility and whether or not they think that $4, but also more importantly, what their expectation is of future auctions is going to be, as well as what their expectation is for energy prices, as well as what their expectation is for earnings from ancillary services. So it's a pretty complex decision that can't be made by saying a given price is $4, do I make a go or no-go decision?
But the given price at $4 is a very important factor that would have to be considered.
Certainly.
All right. Back to page 11. Line 4. In FCA 11, there was an increase of 269 megawatts of cleared capacity, correct?
Correct.
But there were no new fossil fuel plants that received CSOs in FCA 11, correct?
I believe that is correct, yes. Sorry, I was just rereading the summary, but
That's fine. And please understand, take all the time you need to reread, because I want to make sure that you understand the question and that you have the maximum information to give the answer.
Thanks.
Now, after stating there was an increase of 269 megawatts in cleared capacity relative to the previous year, you explained that the majority of the increase was from passive demand resources or energy efficiency, which cleared 422 megawatts more than FCA 10, correct?
That's correct.
And you stated there was an increase of 7 megawatts of cleared wind and solar, correct?
Correct.
And a decrease of 214 megawatts of cleared import capacity, correct?
Correct.
And the remainder of the difference in cleared capacity from FCA 10 was from uprates and derates, which you explained in the footnote at the bottom, to existing generation resources, as well as some minor retirements, correct?
Correct.
And on line 13, you state, capacity that clears an FCA is by definition a very strong indication of need. And you still believe that, correct?
Yes.
Page 18, please. Lines 1 through 3. We're still looking at the results of FCA 11, correct?
Yes.
Right. And you state, while there were 1,522 megawatts of static delist bids submitted as part of FCA 11, not all of that capacity ultimately exited the market. There was approximately 1,280 megawatts of static delist bids submitted in FCA 11 that ultimately stayed in the market during FCA 11, correct?
That's correct.
In other words, the overwhelming amount of static delist bids or retirements that were proposed stayed in the market but did not retire, correct?
In FCA 11, that's correct.
Is it fair to say, and maybe I'm just restating, that a lot of the retirements you discussed in your earlier testimony have not occurred as forecasted?
I wouldn't say as forecasted, because in the FCAs that have cleared to date, I didn't, as part of my analysis, I didn't have those units retiring. A majority of those units, most of those units have been identified by ISO New England originally as part of the 2016 Annual Energy Outlook, also in the 2018 Annual Energy Outlook, which I reference in my testimony, and that capacity is still considered at risk. Portions of that capacity have submitted delist bids. There's Mystic is a whole separate situation, so they are still, I would consider, at risk. But I haven't made specific assumptions in the cleared auctions to date that they were supposed to retire and didn't.
Would you agree that over the years in which you've been filing testimony in this matter, which is about 3 years, that the pace of retirements that you were looking at in actuality is less than what you were assuming?
No, I don't think I would characterize it that way. I mean, to me, pace of retirements would mean that I assumed some retirements were going to happen that didn't happen. To be clear, in the FCAs that have cleared to date, 10, 11, and 12, the only capacity that I've assumed to retire, subject to check, is Pilgrim and Bridgeport Harbor. And those are retiring on schedule. So I would say, as far as what I have assumed in my analysis to retire and what is expected to retire, that has been correct.
Right, so you made two different statements here. What you assumed in your analysis to retire and what is expected to retire, right? You're talking about at-risk retirements? You don't know that any of those will in fact retire, do you?
I have not made the assumption that any of those plants will retire in my analysis. So when I project Clear River, the need for Clear River and the impact of Clear River, I am not swapping Clear River in for some of that at-risk.
Okay.
I think it's a strong consideration, and I think a majority of that capacity will retire, but certainly I don't think anybody knows firm dates of when that capacity will retire.
Okay. And this is a strong consideration, and in fact, ISO/NE, in setting the installed capacity requirement, carefully looks at projected retirements, correct?
Absolutely.
And so when they set that installed capacity requirement, it already factors in what ISO believes will be the expected retirements, correct?
Well, when they're setting the installed capacity requirement, that's really the demand side part of the equation. So in a way, it doesn't really factor in retirements.
At all?
No, because the installed capacity requirement is the amount of megawatts, the minimum amount of megawatts that's needed. So that's a demand number. And then you need this amount of supply to meet that. So from a planning perspective, the ISO looks at what's the existing supply, what is in the queue for new development, what could potentially retire. But the demand number is the demand number, absent whatever they might think about those retirements.
I follow you, but clearly ISO takes a very careful look at expected retirements.
Yes.
Could you look at page 36, please?
Okay.
Down at the bottom, you are, starting on line 17, disagreeing with certain aspects of Mr. Walker's testimony, correct?
Yes.
And in lines 23 through 24, you talk about examples of Mr. Walker's unsupported and incorrect statements include but are not limited to the following. 1, he claims that CREC Unit 2 will not clear in the next several auctions. Do you see that?
Yes.
You felt that that was unsupported and incorrect, correct?
Correct.
But in fact, Unit 2 did not clear in the next several auctions, did it?
Well, I believe I was making this statement.
Well, wait a minute. Could you answer the question? Did Unit 2 clear in the next several auctions?
How are we defining several?
Excuse me, first of all, he's asked an incomplete, he's carved the statement out of the next sentence at the top of the next page. I think it's an inappropriate question. He also cut him off when he was trying to answer the question. I believe he should be allowed to answer the question.
I'm sorry if I cut you off. Go right ahead.
So I guess how I would define several is 3 or more. So there's 2 things that I would comment on this. The statement, and then I'll read it, regarding Mr. Walker. He claims that correct Unit 2 will not clear in the next several auctions, but fails to conduct any analysis of the future supply and demand in the market. So that is the statement. So my criticism is not that he's saying that correct will not clear. It's that he's saying that correct will not clear with no basis for that statement. He's just saying it won't clear. As I discussed with Mr. Elmer this morning, my assumption is that correct will be allowed to participate in future auctions. And to the extent that it's allowed to participate, I believe that it will clear. So it did not clear FCA 12, or it did not clear FCA 12. It won't participate in FCA 13. My assumption that it will participate in FCA 14 and clear FCA 14.
Mr. Walker predicted that Unit 2 would not clear in FCA 12 and FCA 13, correct?
I'm not sure about FCA 13. I believe that's correct. But my criticism was that he was saying that he did not conduct any analysis to determine that. He just said it won't clear.
That was your reading of his testimony,
That's
is that
correct.
he had no analysis.
That's correct.
But you also said that he was incorrect. Isn't that what you said? So it says, line 23, Mr. Walker's unsupported and incorrect statements.
Yes, and the first one is that Unit 2 will not clear, and he has failed to conduct any analysis of the future supply and demand of the market.
Right, well, the analysis that you believe he failed to conduct, which we dispute, but you said he failed to conduct it, that's the unsupported reference in line 23. But you then go on to say, and incorrect. Mr. Walker was in fact correct, at least for the next 2 auctions.
So, well, there are, if I may?
Well, I'd really appreciate if you at least answer the question, and if you need to make an explanation, go right ahead. Was he correct?
My statement is that there are examples of Mr. Walker's unsupported and incorrect statements. I then follow with 3 examples. The third example, he states that capacity above the NICR is not needed. That's an incorrect statement, and I stand by that.
But I'm not asking about that third part, I'm asking about the first part. Was Mr. Walker correct about predicting that Unit 2 would not clear in the upcoming auctions, the next several auctions?
I'm confused on what the question is now. So
The question is...
because there was unsupported and incorrect.
We're talking about incorrect.
Okay.
Was Mr. Walker correct or incorrect when he said that Unit 2 would not clear?
He was correct.
And were you correct or incorrect when you said that Unit 2 would clear?
I was incorrect.
Thank you. Good news is we're moving on to volume 2.
Did you say the good news?
So at this point, I'm moving on to your September 1st, 2017 rebuttal testimony in this document.
Okay.
Do you have it? I do. Yes. All right. Page 2, please. Up at the top, it indicates that the Connecticut Siting Council decision is the subject of this discussion, correct?
Yes.
And you point out in lines 8 through 11 that the Killingly Energy Center in Connecticut does not have a CSO, correct?
Correct.
And then you're critical of the Connecticut Siting Council on lines 11 through 12 when you state, the Connecticut Siting Council's decision took a narrow view of reliability need and indicated that if a resource has not cleared an auction, it is not needed in the market. Did I quote that correctly?
Yes.
And by the auction, we're referring, of course, to the forward capacity auction, correct?
Correct.
Page 6, please. Line 11. It's a heading, it says, CREC has cleared the FCA and retains the capacity supply obligation. But that's no longer the case, correct?
It did clear the FCA, that's still true. It no longer has a capacity supply obligation.
Thank you. Line 13, does CREC have a capacity supply obligation? Answer, yes. Currently, that answer is no, correct?
That's correct.
I know you talked about this a little bit with Mr. Elmer. I'm not going to go into much detail, but on page 8, starting on line 11, please. CREC Unit 1 cleared 485 megawatts in the FCA and has a 7-year obligation to provide capacity, and is therefore part of the package needed for reliability in New England during this time period. Did I read that correctly?
Sorry, what
Page 8,
Oh, page 8.
starting at line 11.
Yes.
All right, and that concept of being part of the package, you got that from the Connecticut decision, correct?
That's correct.
And then you go on to criticize Mr. Fagan on line 13. You say, Mr. Fagan's attempt to break apart the auctions results, and there's a typo there, I think. It says results and cherry pick. I meant to say something like results in cherry picking, which resources are needed and which resources are not needed. And it's fundamentally antithetical to ISO and its market structure.
I don't think it's a typo.
Okay, maybe I might have read it incorrectly.
The results is, in this case, is a noun and not a verb.
I'm sorry, I read it incorrectly. Let me try it again. Mr. Fagan's attempt to break apart the auction's results and cherry pick which resources are needed and which resources are not needed is fundamentally antithetical to ISO and its market structure. Did I read it correctly that time?
Yes.
But isn't it a fact that ISO broke apart that package by terminating the Unit 1 CSO?
No, I think they terminated Unit 1 CSO because the plant is delayed, and as part of the tariff, it closed out of obligations for 2 consecutive capability periods.
Well, that may be why they broke it apart. But the fact remains that it's been broken apart. Isn't that correct?
Not in the way that I was discussing it here. They made an evaluation on a plant that's not going to meet its schedule. That's part of their tariff.
The package that you're referring to no longer exists as that package, as it was originally awarded in that FCA, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Page 11, line 9. No party in this proceeding has argued that the 5,500 megawatts of capacity that ISO NE has identified as at risk would likely retire at once. While it is certainly possible, I agree with Mr. Fagan that such a scenario is unlikely to occur. And you still feel the same way?
Yes. Although I guess I would just add, I think that number now is closer to 8,000 megawatts.
Page 14, please. Line 13 to 14, the summer peak load forecast in the 2017 CELT report. You understand that's an ISO report that determines how much capacity, energy, load, and transmission. Got that right? CELT?
Yes.
Is lower than the forecast from the 2015 CELT report. Do you know if the number in the 2018 CELT report is the same or lower with regard to peak load than 2015?
For what year?
2018. Is 2018 lower than 2015?
Sorry, the 2018 self-report's projection.
For summer peak load forecast?
For
Yes.
For what year?
Well, I'm asking you, what is the forecast for summer peak load that you're referring to for the 2017 CELT report? I'm just asking you to bring it up to the 2018 report. Let's start again. I'm sorry if I'm confusing.
I believe, subject to check, that this is referencing the forecast of the 2017 summer peak load, comparing the 2015 report for the 2017 summer to the 2017 report for the 2017 summer.
Okay,
So
that's
the 2018 report wouldn't forecast the 2017 summer peak load.
well. It would forecast what summer peak load then?
2018, 2019, 2020, I forget what year it goes, but it goes out several years.
I'm just asking you, and I'm sorry if this is becoming unnecessarily complex, but I'm just asking you to bring it up to the next year. You know, you're not following.
I think he's asking whether the summer peak load is going downward. You talk about Mr. Walker saying it will continue on a downward trend. I think Mr. McAvoy's asking if that's working.
Okay. I'll step away from this because I think maybe we're getting into too much detail. Let me see. You tell me if this answers your question. There has been a downward trend in the forecast for summer peak demand over the last 6 years. Going into the forecast for FCA 13, the net ICR requirement for FCA 13 is higher than it was for FCA 12.
But by a very small amount.
By a very small amount. That's
25 megawatts.
correct. About 25 megawatts, that's correct.
And the primary driver for that was a change in the reserve assumptions, wasn't it?
That's correct, which if you read past this comparison of 17 to 15, what I say is, not only has Mr. Walker not quantitatively demonstrated that peak demand forecast will continue this downward trend. I think it's very dangerous to say the last few forecasts show a trend that is going downward. We've seen that, we've seen trends that go upward, and say that's going to continue in perpetuity. We're going to continue for several auctions. I shouldn't say perpetuity. Second point I make is, more importantly, Mr. Walker is only considering one variable. So to your point, FCA 13's peak net ICR is going to be higher. Peak demand that goes into that ICR is actually lower, but there have been other changes relative to the ICR calculation that make net ICR higher. So
primarily that, I'm sorry, you weren't finished. Go ahead.
My only point there, that there are multiple factors to consider, that's all.
I think we can all agree with that. But would you agree with me, though, that the change to the reserve assumption is an assumption that's built into the calculation?
Yes.
And it was a substantial change of 500 megawatts or so.
It was. And the assumption that was in the ICR calculation was from 1991. That was updated.
If you were going to compare the numbers on a year-to-year basis using the same assumptions and backing out the recent change in the assumption as opposed to the demand numbers, there would have been a substantial drop of about 475 megawatts, correct?
If you were just going to look at that component and ignore other changes, yes.
All right. Page 21, please. Line 18. It says, Invenergy has stated that it plans to secure firm gas transportation service for at least a portion of its fuel requirements, indicating that it would be less likely to experience complete natural gas supply curtailment that would force it to switch to burning ULSD, ultra-low diesel, sulfur diesel, thank you, than generators with interruptible service arrangements. Do you see that?
I do.
Are you aware of any contract, a firm binding contract that Invenergy has signed that would secure firm gas transportation service for any portion of its fuel requirements?
I'm not aware of any contract, and just for clarification, when we modeled this plant in our analysis, we did not model any firm gas transportation in our analysis.
Okay. If Invenergy had signed a firm gas transportation contract for any portion of its fuel requirements, it would have let you know that, I assume, correct?
I would believe so, yes.
All right, so next I'd like to move to your pre-filed supplemental testimony on November 20th, 2017.
Okay.
Down at the bottom on page 1, please, lines 17 to 18. You stated that the analysis that underpinned your previous testimonies assumed that CREC Unit 2 would be able to participate in FCA 12, but the determination that CREC Unit 2 will not be able to participate, going over to page 2, line 1, potentially impacts the timing of when CREC Unit 2 could enter the market, correct?
Correct.
Now on page 2, line 7, I'd like to follow up a little bit on something Mr. Elmer asked you. I'm not trying to be repetitive, but to get a little clarification.
Sure.
You stated that you updated your analysis to assume that CREC Unit 2 participates in FCA 13 versus FCA 12, and you made no other assumption changes. You were drawing a distinction with Mr. Elmer between the assumption that CREC would be eligible to participate in FCA 14 versus a forecast that it would be awarded a CSO in FCA 14. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, this statement deals with FCA 13, but the
I
discussion
understand.
with Mr. Elmer was about FCA 14, and your statement is correct.
All right, and so I'm going to ask basically the same question here. When you said you updated your analysis to assume that it participates, does that mean, do I need to read between the lines that you're assuming that it participates and that you're forecasting that it would be awarded a CSO?
That's correct.
All right. Now you have attachments on this. I'm sorry. Could you look at page 5?
Okay.
Nope, I don't need to cover that. Let's go look at the attachments after all. You have, it looks like a PowerPoint. It's on page 10. I believe it's your first attachment.
I don't have
No,
the attachments in front
You
of
don't?
me.
Okay. Are they available?
This is 37B. You have them, you should have them there. They're the attachments.
It's 3. It's at the back of the testimony. It's
The printout I have here is just the testimony. There were some of the attachments were long, so they're in a separate binder that I don't have in front of me. Apologies.
You shouldn't have it. Those were only for C
Oh,
that
is
you
it?
don't have it.
Okay, my apologies, they are here. I thought the attachments were in a separate, but it looks like I have them. So, there we go.
That's the page.
if Ms. Verdi put that together, you got everything you need.
Okay.
So I'm looking at the ISO document that I believe is attachment 3,
Okay,
and I would like to direct your attention to page 10.
got it.
I think they'll bring that up on the board as well. Perfect. Now, the heading of this says, energy efficiency and renewable resources are trending up in New England, correct?
Correct.
There are then 3 bar charts, one for energy efficiency, one for solar, and one for wind, correct?
Correct.
Starting first with energy efficiency on the left, energy efficiency through 2016 was 2,100 megawatts, correct?
Correct.
And projected energy efficiency in 2026 is 4,500 megawatts, more than twice, correct?
What's proposed, yes.
Moving to the bars in the middle for solar, photovoltaic through 2016, 1,900 megawatts, correct?
Correct.
And projected in 2026, 4,700 megawatts of solar, correct?
Correct.
And then to the right, wind, existing 1,100 megawatts, correct?
Correct.
And proposed 7,300, correct?
Yes. I would just note that for solar and wind, these are nameplate capacities. So in terms of, if we're thinking about these in terms of megawatts to count towards reliability, those numbers would be significantly derated.
Right. But the nameplate capacity applies to both the existing bar as well as the proposed bar.
That's correct.
The next page, please, of that exhibit. It says at the top, a hybrid grid is emerging. Do you see that?
I do.
It says the region is changing how it generates, delivers, and uses electricity. The first bullet point says, large grid-connected power resources plus thousands of small behind-the-meter resources, correct?
Yes.
And you know from your experience that that's exactly what's happening, correct?
In certain instances, in certain markets, I think the grid is changing, yes.
You don't disagree with what grid is, ISO is saying here, do you?
I haven't verified if there are thousands of small behind-the-meter resources. I have no reason to disagree with it.
All right. The next bullet point says changes in how much grid energy people use and when they use it. There are changes occurring there. You agree with that, correct?
Yeah, I think that relates to energy efficiency, which we saw from the previous slide is increasing.
And the third bullet talks about significant amounts of variable generation and some battery storage. And that's happening on the system, correct?
Correct.
Do you have an ISO press release for the finalized results of the 12th FCA at the back of your exhibits?
I don't think so. Is it one of the attachments to the supplemental testimony?
I thought it was. It's the ISO press release. Maybe I misplaced it in my binder.
Is it?
I didn't have Ms. Verdi to assist me in putting my binder together. Let me do it the old-fashioned way. I'm going to read you a couple of statements from what I'll represent to you is the ISO New England press release confirming the results of FCA 12, okay? The first sentence says, finalized results filed today confirm that New England's annual capacity auction concluded with sufficient resources to meet electricity demand in 2021-2022 and at the lowest price in 5 years. Is that consistent with your understanding of FCA 12? The second paragraph, starting with the second sentence, says the auction acquired 30,011 megawatts of generation, including 174 megawatts of new generation, primarily in increased output at existing plants. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yes.
The auction also procured 514 megawatts of new energy efficiency and demand reduction measures. Does that sound consistent?
Yes.
In all, about 3,600 megawatts of energy efficiency and demand response cleared. Is that consistent?
Yes.
There's no reference to any new generating plants, correct?
That's correct.
There is a fairly standard paragraph that appears in most of these press releases at the bottom of the page, and the first sentence says, the FCM is designed to procure the resources that will be needed to meet projected demand in 3 years' time. And you agree with that?
Yes.
Second sentence says capacity resources can include traditional power plants, renewable generation, imports, and demand-side resources such as load management and energy efficiency measures, correct?
Correct.
The next page summarizes auction results in FCAs 7 through 12. The only thing I want to do is read to you the 3-year trend for new generation. And this, I would only ask you to accept this subject to check. But for FCA 10 in 2016, there was 1,459 megawatts of new generation. For FCA 11, 264, and FCA 12, 174. Would you accept that subject to check?
Yes.
I'm going to move to your second supplemental testimony on September 14th, 2018.
Okay.
Okay, so page 5, lines 11 through 13 is a heading, and you repeat again, as you have previously a number of times. CREC has cleared the forward capacity auction, which is the competitive market, demonstrating that the facility is needed to meet regional capacity needs, correct?
Yes.
Page 6, line 8. Has any new evidence surfaced suggesting that CREC Unit 1 no longer has cleared the forward capacity market? Answer, no. CREC Unit 1 has cleared the forward capacity market through May 2026, signaling a near-term need for CREC's capacity. There has been no action by the ISO-NE to remove this obligation that was established when CREC Unit 1 cleared FCA 10. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And that's no longer the case, correct?
The CSO has been terminated, that's correct. It did clear the auction.
Agreed. I understand the distinction you're drawing. On the same page, page 6, lines 23 to 24. You're saying, line 24, CREC Unit 1 has a multi-year obligation to provide capacity to ISO-NE, correct?
That's correct.
But that capacity does not need to be provided by CREC, does it? So, for example, in this case, in the annual reconfiguration auction, that capacity was assumed by another provider, correct?
Well, this is one that we have discussed. It is CREC's obligation unless or until they close out of that obligation. And that obligation may be taken on by supply, or it could be taken on by the demand side. That's not known.
Bottom line is that obligation to provide capacity no longer exists for CREC.
That's correct.
Would you agree with me that under the, well, let me back up. You've read the Energy Facility Studying Act, that this board is governed by, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree with me that in terms of making a finding as to whether or not the plant is needed, the Energy Facility Studying Act specifically directs this board to look at, quote, long-term state and/or regional energy need forecasts, end quote. Would you agree with that?
I certainly think that's part of their direction, yes. I don't know that that is all of their direction. I think we talked about that in our most recent testimony.
Now on page 9, please.
Okay.
Page, line 6. Question, do you believe there is additional capacity at risk for retirement beyond what is listed in the 2016 and 2018 regional energy outlooks? Your answer is yes. For example, Dominion Energy's CEO, Paul Kuntz, wrote a letter on July 2nd, 2018, specifying that the 2,095 megawatt Millstone power station located in Connecticut is at risk. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, you're aware that Millstone is no longer at risk?
That's correct. They're going to receive payments for effectively zero emission credits, although I'm not exactly sure what Connecticut calls them, which will allow the plant to remain in the market.
Now, I furnished Mr. Blazer and the other parties to this case with 2 articles concerning Millstone. I'm assuming you've had a chance to see them?
I have.
I have hard copies for anyone who hasn't seen it or would like to have it in front of them, and I would like to have it marked. Do you have it in front of you?
I don't.
Who does it, Cooper? Oh,
I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's okay.
Well, it's-
Do you have these, Craig?
It's 41.
Oh, you got them up there?
Yep. It's 40.
39 and 40 were the two Walker's confidential. I think this is 41.
Nope. Well, I already have a 40. It was the 41, so this will be 42, I believe.
What is 41?
41 was the Walker pre-filed, the confidential or the pre-filed?
I thought Walker was 39 and
Yeah,
40.
oh. Okay. We can make it 41 if I have to change it.
All right, thank you. Is there any objection to this being marked full?
No objection.
No objection. So I'd so move.
How about the back row? Thank you. There being no objection, or both.
Thank you. We all set?
Yes.
So, Mr. Hardy, you've had a chance to read these two articles.
Yes.
Could you look first at the utility dive article, which is the third page in?
Okay.
And this was just published a few days ago on January 3rd, correct?
That's correct.
And the heading says, Connecticut moves to preserve Millstone Nuclear Plant with 10-year power deal. Do you see that?
I do.
The first bullet point says, Connecticut officials on Friday moved to secure the future of Dominion Energy's Millstone Nuclear Plant, selecting a 10-year bid for power from the facility as part of a solicitation for carbon-free generation resources. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And that's your understanding?
Yes.
Second bullet says, Millstone was selected alongside 165 megawatts of solar energy, 300 megawatts of offshore wind, and contributions from New Hampshire's Seabrook Nuclear Plant as part of a request for proposals RFP issued in May by the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection DEEP. Altogether, the accepted bids represent about 45% of Connecticut's electric load. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, that's what it says.
And that's your understanding, correct?
I haven't verified the 45%.
Okay. Other than that, that's your understanding?
Yes.
If you could look at the Associated Press release, that's part of this package, dated December 28th.
Okay.
Down at the bottom of the first page, it says Virginia-based Dominion Energy had sought for months to have its Millstone nuclear power station in Waterford, Connecticut, included in the clean energy procurement. Dominion had argued that the plant faced closure due to rising expenses and competition from natural gas, correct?
That's correct.
And that's what led you to believe that it was at risk for retirement, correct?
Yes. I mean, what led me to believe that it was at risk for retirement is the CEO of Dominion that owns the plant said that it was at risk for retirement.
So, and so at the top of the next page, it quotes a top Dominion executive as saying that the company has pleased Millstone as part of the portfolio. DEEP selected a 10-year bid for about 50% of the entire nuclear facility's output. DEEP also selected a bid from the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant in New Hampshire, correct?
Correct.
So there's no doubt in your mind that Millstone is no longer at risk for retirement, correct?
With this contract, I would say they're not at risk for retirement. And just to clarify, we were not retiring Millstone in our analysis at that point.
No, but you specifically referred in your testimony and added into your at-risk retirement facilities the Millstone Power Station on page 9, line 11, correct?
And it absolutely was at risk for retirement.
And it is no longer.
That's correct.
Right. On page 15, line 19 through 20, you state that recent experience within the ISO-NE market demonstrates that most renewable resources are not currently cost-effective compared with other alternatives. Do you see that?
I do.
Have you seen the pricing on the Vineyard Wind proposal in response to the Massachusetts solicitation?
I believe I saw a press release on it, but I can't remember what that price was.
If I said it was 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour, would that refresh your recollection? No, if not, that's fine.
Hey, I'll take your word for it.
Do you think that's a cost-effective price?
I think that is higher than the prevailing market price.
Well, is it a cost-effective price compared with other alternatives?
Compared to what alternatives?
Well, this is what I'm quoting you here. On page 15, line 20, you're saying that renewable resources are not currently cost-effective compared with other alternatives. I'm asking you if the Vineyard Wind at 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour, in your opinion, is cost-effective compared with other alternatives.
And compared to what alternatives? I can explain that statement, if that's helpful. Is offshore wind competitive with onshore wind?
No, it's
No, it's probably going to be more expensive. Is it cost effective compared to solar? Probably depends on where that solar plant is located. Is it cost effective compared to storage? I would say it's probably cheaper than storage. Is it more cost effective than Clear River? I would say in this case, no.
Would you agree with me that the cost of renewables is dropping rapidly?
Of what renewables?
Most renewable resources is a language that you used in your testimony.
I would say that the cost for solar has dropped pretty significantly in the last couple of years. I would say the cost for wind is dropping less rapidly and is a more mature technology that is not seeing the same cost declines.
Well, it is seeing cost declines.
Less so as compared to solar. I mean, it's a broad statement, so I guess it's
Well, it's your statement. I mean, I'm just asking you. Trying to use your phrasing. I'm not trying to trip you up.
So what statement are we talking about in particular?
Again, page 15, lines 19 through 20. Recent experience within the ISO-NE market demonstrates that most renewable resources are not currently cost-effective compared with other alternatives. I'm using your language.
Okay.
And I'm asking you whether or not you feel that that's changing, whether they are becoming more cost-effective compared with other alternatives.
Yes, they are becoming more cost-effective, but this is a partial statement. There is a full sentence in the statement.
I understand.
Context.
Page 19, please. Lines 11 through 14. You ask yourself the question, based on actual FCA results, has ISO&E routinely cleared capacity above the NICR, the net installed capacity requirement? And you answer the question, yes. Since ISO&E instituted a downward sloping demand curve in FCA 9, ISO&E has procured approximately 1,200 megawatts of capacity above the NICR on average, and the words on average are bolded, in each auction. Is that correct?
Yes.
On page 20, we've already talked about this briefly, but starting on line 3, we're talking about the change with regard to the 10-minute operating reserve requirement that we discussed earlier.
Yes.
And on line 12, you indicate that that change would increase the NICR by a 550 megawatt amount, which is larger than the size of Correct Unit 2 size. You said that the ISO is expected to vote on the recommendation, and they didn't. My question is, they did in fact vote on that recommendation and it was adopted, correct?
Correct.
But the change in the NICR, despite this addition of 550 megawatts to meet the operating reserve, only went up by 25 megawatts, correct?
That's correct.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Yes.
How much a surplus over the net install capacity requirement was procured?
The number that was referenced on page 19 was 1,200 megawatts, and that's an average amount from FCA 9 through FCA 12. So it varied each year. Some years it was less than 1,200, and some years it was more, but on average we procured 1,200 megawatts above ICR.
Do you have access to the exact figures?
Yes, by year? Yes, we can provide those.
Should we make a record request or we get it tomorrow?
I believe they're in the record already. I think we can probably cover it tomorrow.
Thank you.